Thank you very much, David. And perhaps the last point that you raised will certainly be the one that, or one of them that we discuss when we get into the situation. According to his argument, the question is, how do we move from where we are to where we want to be, if of course you assume that the movement from where we are is important. He said a number of things, one of them being that the society is transforming, is in the process of modernization and all of those things, but the colonial state remains in place because, as Olabisi used to say, the colonial governor remains in power. And we have to change the politics. And again, if you buy into the argument that we have to change the politics, it would be interesting to hear how is the politics to be changed? How are the mechanisms? How is the sociology going to change the politics of the society? But all of that will come when we start discussing the matter. My good friend, Dr. Bishnu Ragoonath, is head of the Department of Political Sciences. And Bishnu, you're on stage.
Thank you, Tony. Well, good afternoon, good evening to all fellow panelists. It's a pleasure, and I knew that there was a challenge in coming third, in that a lot of what I wanted to say would have been said already, so now I'm thinking on my feet. But as a political scientist, let me just say several things as we start. One, when we talk people participation, why do we need people's participation? For the simple thing of legitimacy. Legitimacy as opposed to legality. And a constitution is a legal document. Everybody accepts that. The question is, but does it have legitimacy? And it's the same thing that when we talk about, it goes back to, whenever I talk about this, I talk about, when they, long ago, they talk about the illegitimate child. But that was a legal entity. Likewise, the Constitution is a legal entity. Legitimacy here talks about acceptability. If we have a Constitution that nobody accepts as being responsive to their needs, responsive to how we should govern ourselves, how we should live our lives, then that is not a Constitution of the people. And that's why we need people participation to get legitimacy, to get buy-in by the people. Now, as a political scientist here too, this brings me to yet another challenge. How do we get legitimacy? When we utilize a system of what we call representative democracy as opposed to direct democracy. So we vote for a member of parliament. He goes to parliament or she goes to parliament and represent us. Whether they hear our views or not, they go there and speak. Whether that is whether we accept it as part and parcel of how we think, that doesn't matter. They speak on our behalf. And that is part of the challenge that we have in terms of part of our Constitution, because our Constitution speaks about representative democracy. There are no real mechanisms within our existing Constitution for direct democracy. For instance, a referendum. If we need to have direct democracy, we have no mechanism in there to say that all of us as citizens could go and say, there's an opportunity, we could go and vote and say, we don't want this. No. The only option, the only mechanism that currently exists in the existing Constitution is representative democracy. And that's part of our challenge. The issue here then is, how do you move from here to there? That is something we're going to have to discuss. When Olabisi, for instance, spoke about whether we should have wholesale constitutional reform or piecemeal constitutional amendments, that is an issue that we really have to deal with. Because, as David correctly said, the constitution that we have right now is a constitution that has long past its usefulness. I hope I'm not paraphrasing you wrong, but it's long past its usefulness in that we cannot get all that we want out of that constitution, and that constitution cannot help us in the modern contemporary period. So we need reform, but here comes the challenge. Who's going to support it? In a plural society like ours, and in fact I'll go even further to say, we not only plural, but I would say we are a bipolar society. And in a bipolar society like ours, where we have people on two different extremes, none of whom looking for a middle ground, where do we get that type of reform coming from? If I go to outside right now and I ask all the UNC people, do you support the amendments that were to Parliament? And they will all say yes. Whether they understand it or not doesn't matter. Likewise, if I go to the PNM, do you support the amendments or not? They will say no, even though they don't understand what went on there. That is part of our challenge. Our society, we have not matured in a way where we have allowed party politics to dictate how we live, and in that regard, it impacts negatively on our ability to really have people's power or people's participation in governance. You know, the last point I'm going to raise here is simply this. In the system of government and opposition, if we were in England, we'd say Her Majesty's loyal opposition. In Trinidad, we have the opposition. And the opposition, some people will say, is there to oppose. That is not what an opposition is supposed to be. An opposition is supposed to be constructive or give constructive criticism. Sometimes they will oppose. And when I say opposition here, I'm not talking here about the PNM and the PNM alone. Don't get me wrong. I'm talking about parties in opposition. Once they get into opposition, they oppose. Whether they would have stood for something when they were in government, from the time they lose the election, they are against it. So for instance, we had seen it with the UNC when they were in government. They had said, yes, we wanted the CCJ. From the time they lost the election, no, we don't want the CCJ. So are the parties, or once parties go into opposition,